It's good to meet you all. My name is Areiel Wolanow, and this is a webinar, as titled "Why Blockchain Matters." And what this really means is to try and convey an intuitive understanding of what it is about blockchain that promises to be transformational. A whole lot has been written about blockchain. Some of it even makes sense. But it tends to be about the technology, about the use cases, about how it can be used to make money, save time, help people, etc. But surprisingly little has been written about why. And as a motivator for why it makes sense to think about that question, I want to consider how it potentially can change the world. Start with, I'll talk a little bit about me. I was with IBM for about 12 years. I ran their financial services practice for East Africa. In that role, one of the key things I did was led the team that used machine learning to do credit scoring for M-Pesa, which is the most penetrated mobile payment solution in the world. About 40% of the Kenyan GDP flows through it. So what we did there was, since more than half of Kenyan people don't have access to banking, and even the ones who do don't have the sort of financial history that you could use to assess their creditworthiness using a traditional credit scoring model like FICO. We use machine learning to determine whether or not somebody was creditworthy against their payment stream from M-Pesa, and managed to grow the number of people, primarily small business owners, who could qualify for loans from a peak of 500 per day in a country of 40 million before the project to over 50,000 per day after the project. At the same time, reducing the bank's non-performing loan ratio by 26%. So not only were we able to make microfinance available to a completely new group of people, we actually outperformed FICO and other traditional models in doing that. From Kenya, I then moved to Singapore to open and create IBM's blockchain services practice for the ASEAN region. In that role, I sold and delivered IBM's very first blockchain consulting project, which was trade finance for HSBC and Bank of America. Left IBM to form my own company in 2016. Some of the key projects we did there was building the blockchain trade settlement prototype for Lloyd's of London, the insurance market, as well as designing the blockchain as a solution platform for Deutsche Telekom. On the advisory side, I'm currently an advisor to UK Parliament on blockchain and AI. I've addressed the G20, worked with national regulators like OJK in Indonesia, as well as central banks around the world. Most recently, consulted with the Ministry of Finance for Lithuania to help them develop a position on Libra. In February of this year, when COVID was breaking out, I joined a group of technology, medical diagnostic, and supply chain experts to form Block Bioscience. I'm their CTO, and we are developing a completely self-sovereign immunity passport solution, which literally just went live about 2 weeks ago. So that's a little bit about me. And why I'm up here talking about it, but let's actually talk about some context for why we're thinking about these things. The internet first became commercially available for the first time in 1990. If you look at the world then, about 36% of the world's people were living in extreme poverty, which the World Bank's defined as under $1 a day, inflation index to $1970. 15 years later, the iPhone has been in existence for 8 years at this point. and the number of people living in extreme poverty has fallen 36 down to 10. So the number of people living in extreme poverty has fallen by over 70% and is now below 10% for the first time ever in recorded history. There has never been a time with that much poverty reduction. So the impact that the internet has had on people is overwhelmingly positive. Now, the execution of that amazing benefit has been uneven, and any number of people, particularly people with manufacturing jobs in wealthier countries, it's not to say people haven't been hurt, they have. So it's fair to say that the overall benefit is overwhelmingly positive, but our execution in the details, in a word, sucked. So if we think about blockchain and the impact, it's my view that the impact that blockchain could have is even greater than this. And that's what I want to try and explain why I think that and where I think that benefit will come from. So that's really the motivation, is understanding why DLT in general, beyond blockchain, could have this kind of impact. And the story starts very, very early. The story starts about 12,000 years ago, when people are evolving from hunter-gatherer communities into agricultural communities. So the technological innovation of agriculture fundamentally changes the way people interact. And the main way it does that is it creates this need, which I deem the world's first business requirement, that did not exist when we were hunter-gatherers. And that need is for an independently verifiable record of a commitment between two people. And to explain this, I'd like to walk you through a use case. And this is solidly evidenced by the archaeological record. So this is not just made up. So imagine yourself as a farmer in ancient Samaria, and the size of your farm is dictated by the amount of land that your two cattle can plow in one season. And that, not coincidentally, is how much land it takes for you to feed your family. Further, imagine that your brother has a farm the same size right next to yours. And he's got two cows and he's got his family. But one year, while taking his harvest to market, your brother is ambushed by bandits and killed, who take the cattle and all the grain. You now are responsible for feeding not only your family, but your brother's family. But your cattle can't do that because your field is only as big as your cattle alone can plow, and your brother's family, who you're now responsible for, might starve. So you make a deal with a neighbor whose cattle have given birth this year and has a yearling oxen you can use to help plow your brother's field. And you do a deal with your neighbor and you say, if you lend me your cows for 2 weeks so I can plow my brother's fields, I will give you 10 bushels of grain at harvest time. So you do the deal, and you then plow your brother's fields, you go to harvest, and you take the grain to your neighbor and say, here are your 10 bushels, and your neighbor says, wait a second, you said 12. I said, no, I said 10. And let's assume in this use case that both of you are sincere in your belief that your memory is correct. Nobody's trying to swindle anybody here. What happens is trust breaks down. Next year, you can't do the deal because you don't trust each other. And once again, you're at risk of failing to feed your brother's family. So this challenge is a challenge that was faced to the integrators of that day and the innovators of that day. People not like, very much like yourselves, who are constantly looking for ways to solve problems. And the innovators come up with a way of solving this problem. And as we do now, they solved the problem with the resources they had at hand. And in ancient Sumeria, the one resource everybody had at hand was mud. So this is a picture of the world's first contract, or at least the first one that we've been able to find in the archaeological record. This thing is called a bulla, and it's made of baked clay. And what you did was you and the person you were doing a deal with would form a hollow ball of clay, and you would put into it these pebbles, or in fact tokens, into the ball of clay that represented the number of pieces of grain that you owed. And then you would fire it and you would hold it together. And at harvest time, you would break it back open and you would count it. And there you had your independently verifiable record of the contract. So this is the world's first contract. Writing has not been, will not have been invented for another 4,000 years at this point. So this is much, much earlier than writing. And this is the first lesson. The world's very first contract, invented 12,000 years ago, was tokenized. Tokens are not a new concept. They're new in a digital form, but they are in fact the world's oldest form of contract, far preceding writing. So think about that. So tokenized contracts were 4,000 years older than writing. We are only 4,000 years older than the pyramids. So 4,000 years before that, that's how long ago tokenized writing, tokenized contracts came into being. So this is great. What this, and the impact that this had, and this is critical when we think about the internet and now, is there in the archaeological record. The moment you start to see these bullae, these contracts appearing, you see something else, which is farms start growing. So this innovation caused people to stop thinking of a farm as a subsistence vehicle, and for the first time in recorded history, or actually pre-recorded history, because there is no writing yet, to think of the farm as an enterprise. So this innovation here is what caused what we now think of as business to happen, okay? Because once somebody had this, they said, wait a second, if I can use one of these contracts to plow my brother's field, why can't I do the same deal with 20 other people? I can now build a much bigger farm, and I can take a surplus to market, and I can build a nicer home, or I could, or I can hire more hands, or I could do, pretty much anything I want. So as soon as we see these appear in the archaeological record, we see the size of farms growing. And they grew to about 20 times this. Get that.
Could you try again?
I'm sorry, Siri's listening in. So farms grew to about 20 times the size that they were before, and then stopped again. So clearly someone had hit a barrier here. That barrier was scale. So imagine, again, you're a farmer who now has this farm 20 times the original size. You walk in one fine summer afternoon to your storehouse, you see a whole rack of these bullae and realize you don't remember how many were in there. You have no idea how many tokens. You don't know what your total commitment is. So once again, the innovators got to work and solved that problem. And the innovation this time was when you created the bulla for the first time, people started putting impressions on the outside to indicate how many tokens were on the inside. So now you could see on the outside how many, and just count how many bushels of grain your total indebtedness was. And once again, once you saw this innovation, you saw farms, you saw the enterprises starting to grow in. So another barrier to commerce was removed with this innovation. What happened next, and this started happening faster, measured in decades rather than centuries. As soon as they were doing this on the outside, these markings started acquiring more meanings. So you could get to the point where you could now do more complex deals, where one of these dots might indicate a bushel of wheat, and perhaps an X or a line could indicate a bushel of barley. The markings on the outside got more and more complex and started indicating different kinds of meaning. The next big innovation was from somebody who realized that the markings on the outside now had conveyed far more meaning than the tokens on the inside, and that these things are breakable, they're hard to carry around. So somebody had, a brainstorm that what if we just flattened this piece of clay and stopped using it a ball and just made a flat surface, and we could write lots more on that surface. The result is something you probably recognize. So 4,000 years after the first contract, we end up with something like this, which is what we now recognize as writing. And that's where it came from. For another 1,000 years after this, writing was only used for one purpose, which was contracts, ledgers, agreements between two people. Okay, and again, you see this in the archaeological record. Farms start growing, and then they stop, and they hit a certain size. So these things are much more complex and evocative, but they've stopped being portable, and they're still only between two people. So they still have a lot of limitations. The next big commerce innovation goes back to the first bullet, which is this needs to be a record between two parties or between more than one parties. This thing is called a tally stick. And again, it is a record of a commitment between two parties, in this case, a debt. And what you did with a tally stick was you would inscribe across a piece of wood a set of lines that indicated how much money or other goods one person owed another. And then you would break the piece of wood in half. And each person would walk away with a piece of wood. And when you wanted to reconcile or pay the debt, you could fit them together and prove that they are still a valid representation. Tally sticks first start showing up a few hundred years BC, and were recognized as legal proof of debt all the way up until Napoleonic courts. So these were valid commercial vehicles, valid contracts for just over 2 millennia, and up until relatively recently. Fun bit of trivia, when you broke the tally stick in half, the larger piece was called the stock, and the smaller piece was called the foil. And the stock always went to the creditor, the person who was owed the money. So the creditor was said to have stock. And that's where the phrase have stock in something came from. The creditor had the larger piece of the tally. Tally sticks were portable, and they allowed an independently verifiable record between multiple parties, but they had limitations in terms of complexity of meaning. So the next thing you saw was one of these, and this is about 800 AD now, and it's called a chirograph. And it's essentially a contract written in triplicate that is cut along wavy lines, done randomly, not drawn, so that when three, in this case, this is a real estate contract, three holders of a contract could put their pieces together and verify that they are in fact the same, one and the same. So chirographs appeared in about 1800, and these started, what happened with chirographs was an innovation in land ownership. This is when you started to see entities other than just aristocrats or nobles owning land. So this made possible more innovations in terms of groups of people owning property, and eventually leading to the rise of what we would call a joint stock or corporation in the 1600s. The next big innovation came in the 1300s, and that was double entry accounting. This allowed for double entry accounting was a major innovation, and it allowed for records to be verifiable and to reconcile, to make sure that you weren't just inventing or fabricating financial evidence, whether that be of debt, of sales, of credit, or indeed of anything else. And it's probably, or is undoubtedly, the most important innovation in commerce in the last 800 years. And it's evidenced by the fact that we still use it. It was actually invented independently twice. The version of it that we have was invented in Genoa in Italy in the mid-1300s. It was actually invented in almost the same way independently in Korea about 200 years prior, in the early 1100s, during the Chosun Empire in Korea. However, though that version of double entry accounting stopped being used when the Chosun Empire was invaded and destroyed by the Chinese. The technology was lost, independently reinvented 200 years later in Genoa. But this system of how to catalog the liabilities, assets, debts, and incomes of enterprises is still what we use today. This gave rise to growth, as I said, of corporations and joint stock companies in the 1600s. And again, what you see over a period of this time, 800 years, is continued growth punctuated by wars, plagues, etc., but largely unchecked growth until the early 1900s. And there appeared to be a cap in size on how large enterprises could grow at that point. And that cap in size had to do with the constraints of manual record keeping. So every time a company doubled in size, it required more than double the number of clerks to keep records. So it got to the point where companies would get so large that it was no longer profitable to keep records on them. So the next big innovation that, again, eased this constraint of size was digitizing double entry accounting. So the world's first digital ledger was deployed in 1955. It was a payroll system for General Electric in White Plains, New York, on a UNIVAC computer. And this innovation, again, erased a barrier of scale for commerce and created what we now recognize as a multinational corporation. They couldn't have existed prior to digitized record keeping because of that barrier to scale. And again, the record we see after 1955 about growth is pretty much unchecked up until maybe 10 years ago. And the next big barrier that we encounter is not scale, but sovereignty. In that each sovereign country has its own rules and is very jealous about guarding its own rules about how records are kept, who you report them to, what principles, what standards you have to enforce, and so forth. So once again, the innovators of our day got to work and tried to come up with a solution to break this latest in a series of obstacles to the growth of commerce, which is sovereignty. And the first big attempt that showed any promise of success was something that most of you will recognize, which is Bitcoin. So Bitcoin was originally published as a white paper in 2008 by the pseudonymous Satoshi Nakamoto. And it, once again, was the latest. It put forward a technology, which we now call blockchain, to solve this latest of barriers of commerce, which is the sovereignty barrier, by creating a unit of account that did not rely on the support or sponsorship or mandate, or as we say, fiat, of any sovereign government. But here we are over 10 years later, and this latest innovation has not yet begun to take hold. And to some extent, this shouldn't necessarily dismay us over much when you think about how long these other innovations took hold. It took over 1,000 years for writing to be used for anything but contracts. You know, so, and while the pace of technology is certainly accelerated rapidly between then and now, it is not necessarily a death knell to this notion of overcoming this latest barrier in growth that Bitcoin has taken 10 years and still isn't a standard. But I would assert that the real problem is not that, you know, it is not one of time, but is a challenge of design. So as an analog, I like to think about MP3 players. MP3 players were not, or the iPod was not the first MP3 player. They'd been in existence for at least 4 years prior. I myself had the unit there you see on the lower left, which was the Creative Nomad Jukebox. I bought that in 1999, and it was amazing. It could hold over 300 songs, and I didn't have to fast forward like I did with my cassette tapes. This was an astonishing bit of kit, which I absolutely loved, but it was clunky. It was hard to use. I mean, I was a computer programmer at the time, and it still took me 15 to 20 minutes to get an album onto this thing. I had to figure out how to transfer files. I had to deal with proprietary data connections. It was not easy to use, and I was fairly technically savvy. So if we think about Bitcoin and why it hasn't taken over the world, I don't think the reason actually is regulation or the fact that it started with criminal enterprise. Criminal enterprise is usually the first technological adopter because by definition, they don't have the same governance barriers that legitimate enterprise does. So again, it is neither dismaying nor surprising that the first people to adopt Bitcoin were criminals. The first people to adopt mobile technology were criminals. The first people to adopt the internet were criminals. This is this is an established pattern. So none of these things are dismaying. The problem with Bitcoin adoption was design. What made the iPod ubiquitous and then gave rise to the iPhone and everything was that it was easy to understand and easy to use. Bitcoin or DLT in general has not had the iPod moment. Right now, if you want to come up to speed and want to start dealing in Bitcoin, there is so much information you need to understand. And again, it is a huge barrier even if you are technologically savvy. You have to understand what public and private keys are. You have to understand, how the Bitcoin settlement system works, what a node is. You have to decide if you want a hardware wallet, a software wallet, a paper wallet. You have to understand the dangers of leaving your money on a crypto exchange. There's an immense amount of knowledge, and most people do not have the time, the interest, or indeed the cognitive load to encompass that. So that in my mind is where we are at in this journey. We are looking for the iPod moment, where somebody takes the idea behind DLT and makes it simple. Makes it simple in the same way that the iPod made it simple to play MP3s. And that hasn't happened yet. We had a glimmer of potential that somebody had solved that last year with Libra, with Facebook's attempt. Facebook had potentially solved the iPod moment, and it isn't dead yet, but they had a different problem, which was reputation. Facebook has had such an appallingly poor record of data governance, of looking after people's data, that nobody trusted them to say, we're happy that you're going to be the sponsor of this much simpler to use than Bitcoin solution. And to be fair to Facebook, it wasn't that they had a bad governance model. Actually, their governance model was excellent. I've reviewed it. As I said, I was hired by the Ministry of Finance of Lithuania to look at it in detail. The Facebook actually did create a very independent and valid governance model for Libra, but nobody trusted them to follow it because of what an appallingly poor record they'd had. So we had a potential iPod moment for DLT and indeed for digital currency that may or may not have passed due to some other issues. So what happens when we have this iPod moment, when we actually can accept a shared ledger as a record of commitment between two parties that breaks the barrier of sovereignty? I want to share a couple thoughts on what would happen and why. The first is looking at a country with runaway inflation like Venezuela. So in 2014, Venezuela had the highest inflation rate in the world at 69%. By 2018, that inflation was over 1.5 million%. So that meant that the bolivar loses 90% of its value every quarter. This is a serious problem because it means if you get paid in cash every Friday, which is the normal case in Venezuela, by the end of the week you can't feed your family. So this is a matter of life and death. So what would happen if the moment you got paid, you were able to convert your currency into a stable coin based on a basket of say the most 5 commonly traded currencies in the world? This is the difference. You now can feed your family. This is the difference between life and death. This is not a tiny thing. We tend to think about Libra as in mature economies as a convenience and say, well, I've got Apple Pay, I've got Google. Why do I need another one of these? In most of the world, it's a very, very different story. The other example I looked at is woven blankets. So in Bangladesh, the average price, on Etsy, the average price of a woven blanket is $69. This is not a scientific study. I did an Etsy search on hand woven blanket and averaged the first 12 hits. But in Bangladesh, the average monthly income of a blanket weaver is $52. So what this means is if I, a blanket weaver in Bangladesh, can sell even one of my hand-woven blankets on Etsy, I have doubled my income. So even a small change like this, like being able to sell my handcrafts to the world because I don't have sovereign barriers, will fundamentally change poverty and the ability to do business for even the smallest of enterprises around the world. But so far, this is all just me saying so and giving you some pretty numbers. Let me give you a real world study to back this up, and then we'll go to questions. There was a study done about 6 years ago in Tanzania, where they looked at emerging micro businesses. And they defined that as a business that grew from 1 to 10 people. So a one-person business is a guy selling fruit on the street to passing cars. And an emerging micro business is where that guy grows to the point where he now has 10 employees. So over a period of about 2.5 years, they looked at emerging micro businesses, and they found that 2% of those businesses emerged. In other words, of all single person businesses in Tanzania over 2.5 years, 2% of those single people managed to grow their business into 10-person companies. That 2% created 25% of all new jobs in the country. So what would happen if by, for instance, letting Tanzanian handcrafters sell their goods on Etsy, we were able to grow that 2% even to 3%. Even a tiny change in access to the world's market could fundamentally transform the entire country. This, in my mind, is, and in summary, is the power of DLT and what it can do and why it has the potential to be so transformative. If I'm successful in giving you an intuitive understanding as you bring your innovations to market about what drives this and about why it matters, hopefully it will help you design solutions that can actually have some impact and have this kind of impact going forward. I intentionally wanted to stop here. I prepared about 40 minutes of sort of content because I'd like to have a discussion. So I'd like to open it up. I'm going to put the open up the chat and start asking questions. So I've got a question here from Chris. What are barriers to DLT in the world? I mean, government, legal, et cetera. Well, so we've seen the government, governments are not very happy about Bitcoin and slightly less unhappy about Libra because they perceive it as a threat to their ability to to control commerce in sovereign countries. Philosophically, you could disagree or agree whether or not a sovereign country has the right or whether it's a good thing that they control this. However, one of the things that's important to realize is that this threat is a valid threat, regardless of whether an individual government could be held to be beneficent or malign in its intent. And what I'm saying is that if you assume a government, whether it's a dictatorship or a democracy, that has in its mind genuinely to help its people, Bitcoin is a threat because one of the ways that you stabilize a country is through effective fiscal and monetary policy. Losing control over your impact through fiat currency means that you can no longer do stimulus spending, for instance. So right now in the lockdown, a lot of us are dependent on these government stimulus programs to keep people paid. If Bitcoin was our standard, governments couldn't do that. So it would be taking away a very key tool for even positively inclined governments to help their people. At least in the short term or without major social upheaval, we will have to look at ways to do this that do not dilute the ability of sovereign governments to stabilize their economies through fiscal and monetary policy. This is possible. It's doable. Libra 2.0, which came out a couple months ago, actually does a fairly good job of squaring this circle. So it's not an insurmountable obstacle, but to finish a long-winded answer, the threat to sovereignty of global digital currencies is a key barrier, but one that I believe is overcomable. The next question I see here is, so let me just back up. Kirsty, regarding governance and control, will CBDC become more popular in finance? Absolutely, yes. One of the reasons, or two of the reasons I just explained around just feeding people or poverty elimination, and the government of Bangladesh, for instance, they're not fools. They want this. The other reason it becomes more popular is it's a geopolitical tool. If you look at if China wants to do an infrastructure project with the Philippines, for instance, right now they have to go through dollars. Well, the U.S. is China's rival. China could very, very easily say, we're going to help you build a dam or put 5G onto the island of Mindanao in the Philippines, but we're going to pay your workers in DCEP. And disintermediate their main competitor in terms of provision of finance. So for the geopolitical empowerment of any CBDC issuing country, that alone is enough motivator to say, yes, absolutely, it will become more popular. From Amelia, if DLT were to be accepted, how would the validation of exchange take place, especially when trading or dealing with emerging market or high-risk countries? Fantastic question, and one that I cannot answer objectively because providing those mechanisms is what I do for a living. So please take this with full disclosure. what I'm going to say is entirely in my own self-interest. To my mind, the important thing, if you want a protocol or an approach that is universally adoptable, is to provide or to ensure that that validation of exchange is pluggable, in a word. The appropriate validation mechanism is going to be different for a land title versus oil rights versus currency versus an insurance contract. So if you want DLT to be accepted as, again, a mutually independently verifiable record of a commitment between two parties, you are going to have to find validation mechanisms that are suitable to the use case and also fit established patterns of trust. The reason that that M-Pesa and worked in Kenya, or that Alipay is so successful in China, is because of where trust is and also where trust isn't. So in case of M-Pesa, for instance, in Kenya, the big problem was carrying cash. It wasn't safe. I've lived in Kenya. Thieves in Kenya go around in armed gangs of 12 or more people. It's no joke. And M-Pesa provide a way primarily for small merchants to do business without exposing themselves to risk. And that's what drove adoption. In China, carrying cash, China's unless you're a political dissident, China's a very safe country with a very low crime rate. Carrying cash was not a problem. The problem there is there's no merchant banking. So the notion of a merchant bank, a commercial bank, small business, the loans for small business enterprises fundamentally doesn't exist. And the unmet demand as of 2018 for commercial credit in China was over $3 trillion. Alipay made the need for commercial banking services irrelevant. And that was drove it there. So the validation of exchange has to fit those established patterns of trust or patterns of distrust, and they have to be industry specific. So you have to design solutions that represent those existing patterns of trust and distrust if you want something to be adopted. Guang asks, do you think CBDC based on DLT is more feasible than one without DLT? Fantastic question. DCEP, which arguably is going to be the first successful CBDC, doesn't use blockchain yet. It's being rolled out as in a domestic pilot, and China has no problem with centralized control and sovereignty over data of transactions in China. DCEP will adopt DLT when it becomes available for international payments. That's how China will provide a method of validation and trust to allow it to be used for, again, for geopolitically competitive purposes like infrastructure projects. People won't accept DCEP without that. And China has been buying up blockchain patents and hiring blockchain talent like crazy. In exchange, in preparation for this next round. If you follow the pattern of how China is hiring people and the growth of companies and the directorships of those companies and how people are moving out from government into key positions of power in the countries, you can see where this is going. So within 2 to 3 years, you will see blockchain-based international payments on DCEP. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a question of evolution. What are my thoughts on DeFi and how it's related to Bitcoin and blockchain in general? My thoughts are immature. I don't yet have a qualified opinion on it, so I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I do think that there's some very exciting work there, and it's a note to Antonio. That's worth it, a webinar in itself, I would say. Does government regulation support mass adoption? Good regulation does. So I mean, I do advisory work for Parliament on blockchain adoption, and I don't get paid for it, and it's a fair investment of time, and I do that for exactly this reason. The group of parliamentarians, there's a parliamentary working group on on blockchain, which is the group that I advise. It might surprise you to know that this group is fairly plugged in. They actually understand it and genuinely are interested in the UK becoming a world leader and want to understand what they as parliamentarians can do to help make that happen. They also genuinely get their commitment to public safety. The bad news is this is a relatively small group and it's self-selecting. So the people who sit on this group of parliamentarians are the people who already understand that well enough to invest some of their time in this committee rather than any one of the other committees they could otherwise serve on. So we have a long way to go, but there is at least a significant cadre of people who do support regulation that will drive adoption. Lack of regulatory clarity is one of the key barriers that keeps businesses from investing in blockchain. So as we see that regulatory clarity come out, we will perforce see more people doing it. Truffle asks, in your example of the iPod moment, haven't we reached our iPod moment yet? If we do reach it, do you expect that only those who can achieve it will be left and other blockchain basics will die out? Yes, and in fact, that's already happened. Actually, there's some research on this. As of mid-2019, there were over 82,000 blockchain projects in the world. 92% of them are already dead. That's actually a really, really low failure rate overall. That's actually a really good result. But most of the world's blockchain projects have already died. So yes, those who fail to achieve the adoption will die. Have we reached our iPod moment? I said, I saw a possibility with Libra last year. Their method was certainly simple enough, but they had other issues. So not quite yet, but I don't think it's far. Jafar, I think DeFi is bringing value and helping bridge between traditional and decentralized. You could well be right. I haven't seen enough details yet to have an opinion. Mussy asks, what are your thoughts on DLT in the sub-Saharan region? What are the IT infrastructure requirements due to the region's electricity problems? Another great question. So I've lived in Africa and I go back there regularly. I believe that the quality of innovation that I see, not out of Africa, so there's a group of countries of which Kenya is one, Indonesia, Mexico, that are just developed enough to have a booming middle class and have really good universities. Those places, Kenya, Indonesia, are where the world's best innovation is coming. Far better than we have here or better than Silicon Valley. So I actually think that developing economies that already have good universities are where the world's best innovation is coming from. And I think that if we see a solution to distributed ledgers that reflect unreliable power grids, Kenya is where I think it'll come from. Antonio, can you share more on the identity work you're doing at Block Solutions and how it's different from other identity related projects? I would love to. This is what I'm currently doing now, and I could talk about it at great length. It is not DLT related, and this is a webinar I promised to give, so it would be hopelessly self-serving if I did that. Let me answer the rest of the questions that are on topic, and if we have any time left, or if people want to go over, I'll be very happy to do that. Does that make sense, Antonio?
Yes.
Okay, great. John Wood, should digital currencies be designed to make currency speculation impossible? I believe that speculators are far cleverer than I am. I've seen no evidence to make me believe that preventing speculation is an achievable goal. As I said, with any new technology, the world's first adopters are criminals. And this is, we should absolutely expect this, because criminals don't actually have to care about their customers. They don't have to care about following regulations. They don't have to care about being shut down. They're already taking all of those risks. So we should expect criminals, scam artists, speculators to be the first adopters of any technology we bring out. We can't let that deter us, and hopefully all we can do is accelerate the adoption curve so that the demands for legitimacy come rapidly. So no, I don't think it's possible to design to make a speculation impossible. I do think it is possible or desirable to develop technology with adoption curves that make it unprofitable to speculate very quickly. Any other questions? All right, well, if there are no other questions, oh, sorry, here we go. From Artemis. Allowing technology to be used for bad purposes because they serve a greater good, oh my. That's my son, by the way. He is a really useful source of QA for the work I do because his relentless cynicism is an excellent temper in crafting my ambitions to the art of possible. So thank you, son. From let's say, appreciate if we can have a follow-up. Absolutely. Yeah, anyone who wants to get in touch with me, here, I'll put my, I'm going to type my email into the chat. You can also just LinkedIn me, just LinkedIn. I am the only Areiel Wolanow on the planet, apparently, at least the only one. So yeah, do feel free to reach out. So yeah, so the work I'm doing now, again, has nothing to do with blockchain. It is a self-sovereign immunity passport, and I wince when I use that word, but it's the word the media uses. It's a self-sovereign health record that is owned exclusively by the person to whom the data pertains. So it's a record whether you're doing a self-declaration in line with current UK guidelines, you're taking a PCR test, you're taking a rapid antibody test, and eventually when you have immunizations. The idea here is that you are the sole possessor of that data. So the solution has no database, central or distributed, has no blockchain, no DLT, because the data only exists on your device. What it is instead is a framework, an assertion framework, where somebody who is, who has an interest, so your employer wants to know if it's safe to have you return to work. An airline wants to know if it's safe to have you board the plane, can ask you a question on your device. Do you meet the current guidelines to come to work, to get on the plane, to do whatever? You then receive a consent message saying this organization with these bona fides wants to ask whether or not they can let you on the plane. Do you consent? And all they get back is the yes/no answer to the question. You never share the data. We don't even, you can get your ID attested by a third party, but nowhere is there even a record of your name because we don't need it to answer that question. So that's what we're doing. We started building it in February. It is currently the only COVID management solution to have ID 2020 certification. In fact, shortly after getting it certified, I was invited by ID 2020 to serve on their technical advisory committee. So I'm really proud of that. We are currently live in the UK with our first customer, which is the David Lloyd chain of gymnasiums. We're going live with another UK customer later this month, and we'll be having going live with solutions in Brazil and in the US in October. So we're doing really well, and we're quite excited about the trajectory. We've grown from 3 people in February to over 60 people now, and it's extremely exciting. Sorry, here, let me put the, looks like I put my email into private chat. I'll put it again here. There we go. Anybody else? Any other questions? All right, well, thanks very much. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.